Jesus took with him Peter, James and John and led them up a high mountain where they could be alone by themselves. There, in their presence, he was transfigured. His clothes became dazzlingly white, whiter than any earthly bleacher could make them. Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Then Peter spoke to Jesus. "Rabbi," he said, "it is wonderful for us to be here. So let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. And a cloud came, covering them in shadow, and there came a voice from the cloud. "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Then, suddenly, when they looked round, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they came down from the mountain, he warned them to tell no one what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They observed the warning faithfully, though among themselves they discussed what rising from the dead could mean. When Philip was a student and I was in Newton Stewart, Philip was sent to me on pastoral placement. It meant every once in a while he'd turn up for a week or so and get involved in whatever was happening in the parish to get a taste for parish life. On his last visit, he brought a bottle of very old port with him, something that had been given to him as a gift, and he brought it to share it. We spent 3 days looking for just the right cheese to go with this port, to supplement what we imagined the taste to be like. But when we opened it and tasted it, it was delicious. It was one of the nicest things, probably the nicest thing I've ever tasted. It was like drinking liquid heaven. Not that I know what heaven tastes like, liquid or otherwise, but it was just, words fail me completely. Unless you've tasted something similar, there's just, no way I can explain the taste of that port to you. If Philip ever offers you a taste of port, take it. Hopefully it will be the same bottle if it hasn't been emptied by now. I would love to explain to you what it tasted like, but I just can't find the words. And without you having a similar experience, I can't even compare it to anything else. I can't say, it's like. That's the same problem that Peter and James and John faced when they tried to tell the other disciples what had happened on the mountaintop. Their words failed them. Their experience of God on the top of that mountain was so far beyond their normal experience that they just couldn't find the words to talk about it. And when they came to explain it to someone else, to the other disciples, there was no common experience. There was nothing in the lives of Peter and James and John and the other disciples that those on the mountaintop could compare their experience of God to and say, it was like the time there was just nothing there. So they did the only thing they thought possible. They looked for others who had had a similar experience, a similar encounter with God, being in the presence of God. And they looked to their scriptures, and they looked to the descriptions, the words that were given to people like Moses and Elijah, who had had their own experience of the presence of God. And they drew on the language of the scriptures. They drew on the scriptural symbols that were associated with those who had encountered God. Peter and James and John and the evangelists, Mark and the others who talk about this experience, this mountaintop experience, aren't trying to give us a detailed description of what happened. This happened, and then that happened, and then the cloud came, and then Jesus' face, and then we heard the voice. They're using symbolic language to say, this was an encounter with God. That's the important thing that happened for them. Not the details of how it happened, but that it happened. One of the things that strikes me about their experience is that they were terrified. Well, not so much that they were terrified, but that Peter wanted to prolong that situation in which they were terrified. I've been terrified very few occasions in my life. I was chased by a snake once. It certainly wasn't an experience I wanted to prolong any longer than absolutely necessary. And when it ended, because one of the kids in the class killed the snake, I was delighted. I was relieved. I certainly wouldn't want to rush back into it. I certainly wouldn't be thinking of putting up tents and staying there. That's the thing that strikes me about that gospel, that the disciples were terrified and yet they wanted to prolong that experience. What was going on? Is terror something that we really want to prolong? Okay, there's a type of fear, isn't there, that we do want to prolong. When you go on a big dipper at the fairground and you get off and go, oh, I was terrified, let's do it again. But that's not real terror, is it? That's not a real fear. Because we know deep down that we're safe, that this ride has been engineered to give us the thrill, to give us the adrenaline rush, but keep us safe at the same time. It's a different type of fear that we experience. And there's another type of fear too. Kind of, anyway. I haven't been on a plane for years. I love flying, but I haven't been on a plane for years. And one of the things I like most is that moment when the engines roar into life and this 1,000-ton metal tube begins to slide down the runway and then lift off into the air. I love the feeling of being pushed back in the seat. I love the idea that this sense of being lifted off the ground by raw power. It's a sense of awe and wonder in the presence of great power, of great speed, of great scale. We can look at the stars at night and be in awe of what we see. Not necessarily, but we can be. Is that more akin to what Peter and James and John experienced on the mountaintop? That sense of awe and wonder in the presence of God, that I could try and sustain. That I would love to revisit. Is it fear? Maybe not. But it gives that same kind of feeling of adrenaline, that same kind of taking your breath away. You know, when I was young and I was confirmed, we were taught of the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, one of which was fear of the Lord. In recent years, when we've been preparing children for confirmation, we haven't so much talked of fear of the Lord, but the gift of the Spirit being a spirit of awe and wonder in the presence of God. I love that image. I love that language, that way of talking to children about the God that loves them. So great, so powerful, and yet so gentle and loving. Sadly, in the last year or two, we've gone back to that archaic notion of being fearful of the Lord. Is that the relationship that you want to have? Being frightened of God? Is that the kind of relationship that leads to love? I don't think so. No. Would you want to stay in the presence of a God of whom you were fearful? Or would you want to stay in the presence of a God all-powerful, ever-present, but ever-loving, for whom you have great wonder? is a fearful God, the God that you would want to stay in the presence of, to live in the presence of, is a fearful God, one that will earn, merit, be given freely your love. I'm happy with that notion of a God in whose presence I am filled with awe. God's great power and scale and majesty, and yet still manages to love even me.